Hey everyone, James Wilson with Pedaling Innovations and MTB Steering Training Systems here, and I hope everyone's having a great week so far. I wanted to follow up on the video that I did last week, and I did a blog post on pedalinginnovations.com as well on this. And basically, I was looking at three studies that I had been forwarded by somebody who had actually suffered a hip injury from crashing while on clipless pedals, and then in his own research into the subject found that there were actually studies that looked at this as well. And so he had forwarded me these three studies. And so I shared them in the post and kind of talked about them and why I thought that it was important that, cycling as a whole stop denying science like this. Like, just because it doesn't reinforce what the story that we like to tell ourselves doesn't mean that we should deny it and not be honest with riders, especially new riders, when explaining to them what the real risk to benefit ratio is, or risks and benefits from both pedal systems, flats and clipless. Because again, this isn't about flats being better. This is about telling people the truth so that they can make up their own mind. But let's tell them the truth so that they have the facts to make up, so they're deciding based on that. But I got quite a few questions and people raising some thoughts and concerns about some of the things that I brought up and about the studies, and there were a lot of good points raised. But they basically fell into two camps, and one was questioning the studies themselves and basically saying like, well, who were these riders that they were looking at? How are things, their pedals set up? Basically, what were the details of this? Because how valid is this to me? Because that may not have anything to do with me, because they may be totally different than me. And again, that is valid. You definitely, asking questions about the studies and looking at them themselves can be very helpful. And the other camp that the questions fell into was, well, I've never had that problem. I've never seen anyone have that problem. And from my perspective, I can get my feet out of my pedals just as quickly or almost just as quickly with clipless pedals as I can with flats. So it doesn't seem to me, based on my own personal experience, that would be a problem. So basically, let's question the studies themselves, and then let's rely on our own personal experience to tell us what's going on. And those are kind of the two camps that a lot of these concerns fell in. But here is again, just kind of both of those are valid, right? Because I'm not saying that your personal experience doesn't have any merit, and I'm not saying that you don't want to question studies. You definitely do. But here's a couple things that you want to consider. One is, it wasn't just one study. There were three studies. And all three studies found the same thing, kind of had the same conclusion. And there are no studies that point in the other direction. So, this is kind of like climate change, right? Like, when you start talking to somebody and you bring up the science and they start denying the science, what do we call them? Well, they're, your climate change denier, right? It's like, dude, there's science, and the trend from the science definitely points in this direction. Now, I understand that there's other arguments, right? Like, oh, the Earth's gone through heating and cooling cycles and stuff like that. And just so you guys know, this is not a political stance. Either way, I'm just using this as an example of of how people can rationalize away science, and it's tough to argue with that, because you can always poke holes in any scientific study. Like, that's the thing, right? But the thing is, when you start to see a trend, when there's multiple studies all pointing in the same direction, and you have minimal to no studies pointing in the other direction, that's what is called a trend. And that trend, in this case, is definitely that if you are clipped in, there's an increased risk of hip injury, severe hip injury, if you're clipped in during a wreck. And so, again, that's, there's always that argument about, well, these studies, blah, 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 and I totally agree. But there's a definite trend in that direction with this. And so if you don't have any studies or any science or anything like that in the other direction, again, in the climate change world, we call you a climate change denier. In the cycling world, we don't have a name for it. It's just a cyclist, basically. Seems to be our term for someone who denies the science that they don't enjoy, or doesn't reinforce the story that they have. But again, like, this is the thing that also, like, not going on too far of a tangent, like, good science is not about just reinforcing what you think you know, right? Good science is about going like, whoa, wait a minute, that's curious. That's not what we expected. Let's look at that more. Right? So when you see a study that shows something that you didn't expect, and especially if you see multiple studies, you see this with the pedal stroke argument all the time. It's like, hey man, there's multiple studies that say you don't want to pull up on the backstroke. And instead of getting curious about that, like your average cyclist gets angry about it. And it's the same thing here. They're like, man, how dare you question, point out this science that doesn't back up what I think. And anyways, that's not what science is supposed to be about. Science is supposed to be about exposing questions for us to investigate, not just reinforcing what we think we already know all the time. Like that's how do we go anywhere? So anyways, the other thing is the personal experience one. And again, this is also, if you've never had a crash where this affected you, or you don't know anyone, again, it can be kind of hard. You're like, man, I don't see this being a problem. But one of the things that I forget if all three of them, but I remember more than one of the studies, one of their conclusions was that when you're wrecking on a bike, especially if you're going over the handlebars, which is one of the most dangerous, wrecks, because you're going directly onto your head if you're not going to be able to get your feet underneath you, that your feet and legs are in a position that make it physically difficult for you to twist your foot to unclip. It's just physically hard in that position. And so, and also when you're wrecking, and wrecks take less than a second. So even if you're able to get your foot off almost as fast as you can with flats, man, that fraction of a second can mean the difference between getting your foot solidly on the ground underneath you or getting away from your bike, or it being a fraction of a second too late and you just taking the impact on your hip. And so, again, like it's hard to just go on your own personal experience, because it only takes one time getting put in one of these positions for things to go catastrophically wrong. And so again, that's where looking at the science and also looking at other people's experiences, like this is one of the things that I also find particularly irritating, is that people aren't really, you can't talk about this, right? Like if riders talk about, hey, I got into a wreck and I wasn't able to get unclipped and it, crashed on my head and it really, caused these problems. Most of the time it's like, man, it wasn't the clipless pedal's fault, right? Like you're not supposed to talk about these things. And so we don't really have the exposure to some of this stuff. And so anyways, I guess my point is that you got to be careful with the personal experience. Like the idea, like I said in the last video, is to bring your subjective experience. It matters, it has value, but you also need an objective viewpoint as well. And that is where science is supposed to step in and help us by providing an objective way to look at things, to help us balance out and say, is my personal experience lining up with this? And if it isn't, is there something else going on here? Like, am I denying certain things? Am I not seeing things the way that they really are? And so anyways, I think in this case, that's a lot of what's happening. So again, like, those are valid concerns, but like I said, you've got multiple studies that definitely create a trend moving in a direction, as far as this goes. And then you've also got just the need for an objective, some objective data. And instead of denying data that you don't like or doesn't reinforce what you think you already know, you should get curious about it and take a look at it and see, is there more there? And is there something that I can gain from, a new insight, a new way of looking at things? And in this case, learning the truth about what's going on, and the truth about the risks and the benefits of clipless and flat pedals, and then making a decision for that based on that. So anyways, like I said, I know this is going to be a never-ending debate, a never-ending thing. I don't know why that simply saying like, hey, attaching your feet to your pedals increases your risk of not being able to get your feet out in time, and that increases your risk of injury to your hip. Also increases, I've talked to, this is the thing too, I've talked to a lot of different riders who've gotten hurt. I've talked to doctors. One rider, it was hilarious, it was a client that I worked with for a while. He was a doctor who got hurt, and he was working in LA, or lives in LA, and yeah, had an over-the-bar crash, couldn't get unclipped, landed on his head, knocked out, luckily nothing too severe, but he woke up, and they'd already taken off his clipless pedals or his clipless shoes, and they brought him into the ER, and the doctor walks in and he's like, oh, couldn't get unclipped, huh? And this guy's like, well, how did you know? Like, I don't have my clipless, shoes on. Like, how did you know what I was riding? He's like, man, if I had $1 for every time one of you guys ends up in here because they were not able to get unclipped and ended up crashing, I could retire. And I've heard multiple stories like this from doctors, from riders who've experienced this. And so, again, like, if you want to talk about personal experience, like some of that's my personal experience, right? It is not only the stuff that I've personally experienced, but also in talking with people who personally experience these things. And again, like the story seems to reinforce what the data says, which is that there is this increased risk of injury. So, anyways, like I said, it's really just a matter of trying to educate people, help them make the best decision for themselves based on the facts and not myths and half-truths and trying to scare people with, magical pedal strokes that only exist when you attach your feet to the pedals, or, telling people like, hey, one isn't safer than the other. They're just different. Like, these things are not true. And they skew the argument in favor of one of the pedal systems, which isn't fair, right? So again, if we're going to say let people choose, then it should be based on the truth and not one party lying to we see this in the political system, right? Like so anyways, like I said, I'm gonna wrap it up. Don't really have any clean way to wrap this one up, this little rant here, just kind of side rant after answering some questions. But again, I hope everybody just understands where I'm coming from with this. It's not about flat pedals being better. It's just about exposing people to the truth. It really annoys me when people are lied to and they make decisions based on these lies and half-truths, and then they end up getting hurt because of these decisions that they made based on these myths and lies and half-truths. And so at the end of the day, that's really what drives me forward and keeps this mission going, is just trying to help riders from falling victim to that cycle, which just seems to be just such a natural thing for the cycling world these days. But anyways, I'm gonna get going. I hope everybody has a great rest of their week. Get out and ride your bike and have fun, and I will talk to everybody next time.